The morning I found out where they'd be sitting, I didn't cancel their tickets. That was the detail everyone asked about afterward. The colleagues who knew the seating chart. The event coordinator who handed me that thick stapled packet across his desk. They all assumed I would have protected myself. That I would have pointed to row 3 and quietly said, "These names need to come off the list." Instead, I handed the packet back to him with both hands, told him the arrangement was perfect, and walked out into the afternoon light feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. My name is Nadia, and I am 31 years old. When I was 23, my mother called me 2 days before my sister's Princeton graduation and told me not to come. She didn't frame it as a request. She said, "Vivianne's friends come from a different world, Nadia. Their families have endowments named after them. We have spent everything building her reputation, and I am not going to let you show up in whatever you found on sale and start talking about your community health rotations. You will look like the hired help. So please, for everyone's sake, stay home." The line went dead before I could answer. I was standing in my kitchen holding a train ticket I'd purchased with a portion of my billing coordinator paycheck, the kind of job that pays just enough to feel like you're surviving, never enough to feel like you're living. I had taken 3 consecutive overnight shifts that week to clear my schedule for the trip. The trip I was no longer taking. I carefully removed the dress I'd bought from the back of my closet and replaced it on the hanger. I had also bought Vivienne a gift, a slim brushed silver pen with her initials engraved on the barrel. I had counted out folded bills at the register to pay for it. I wrapped it in a padded envelope, walked to the post office the following morning, and mailed it without a note. Not out of bitterness. Because I refused to let their contempt turn me small. I had no idea that same pen would end up in a donation bin 7 years later and become the single most clarifying object I have ever held in my hand. To understand how my mother could make that phone call without hesitation, you need to understand what our household ran on. We grew up in a meticulously maintained suburb where social standing was a full-time occupation. My sister Vivienne possessed my mother's bone structure, my mother's ease, and an almost supernatural gift for saying exactly what a room wanted to hear. My parents treated her future like a portfolio they were actively managing. Private tutors, application consultants, strategic extracurriculars, all of it funded without discussion. I learned my place during sophomore year when I asked my father for $60 to purchase a required anatomy textbook. He didn't look up from what he was doing. He said developing self-sufficiency builds character, and I should pick up additional hours at work. 20 minutes later, I watched him hand Vivienne his card to book a ski weekend with her friends because she needed to decompress from the stress of college applications. That was the dynamic. Her comfort was essential. My basic academic needs were inconvenient. I tried to bridge the distance anyway. I thought showing up to celebrate Vivienne's art history degree would finally demonstrate I was worth something to them. The phone call ended that theory. What followed was not a dramatic implosion. It was quieter than that. I blocked their numbers on a Sunday evening after watching my mother post a photograph from the ceremony captioned, "I put it down in a state of absolute bone-deep clarity." I changed my number the following Monday. I removed their names from my emergency contacts. I stopped performing for an audience that had never once turned to watch me. I channeled everything into my work. I was a billing coordinator at a regional hospital system, which sounds administrative until you understand what that position actually contains: an intimate architecture of clinical documentation, insurance codes, procedural records, and patient histories. I spent my breaks reading the charts I processed, teaching myself the diagnostic logic behind every claim I filed. I worked nights. I ate whatever the cafeteria had left at close. I studied for the Healthcare Administration certification exams using secondhand prep guides. The director of clinical operations at our hospital was a woman named Dr. Constance Wyeth. She had spent 30 years building one of the most rigorous compliance divisions in the northeastern region, and she possessed the particular ferocity of someone who had been underestimated for most of her career. She was not warm in any conventional sense. She was honest, which in my experience is rarer and worth considerably more. She noticed me during a quarterly audit review when I flagged a systemic billing error that had been generating significant overpayments to a vendor for 14 months. I had found it not because it was my job to find it, it was nobody's job to find it, but because I had been reading the underlying data closely enough to recognize the pattern. She called me into her office afterward and asked how long I'd been working there. When I told her, she asked why I wasn't in a graduate program. I told her the truth. I couldn't afford the application process, the entrance exams, the credential verification fees. My family didn't support my education. I was saving, but slowly. She set down her coffee with a sharp, definitive sound and looked at me for a long moment. Then she wrote a phone number on a notepad, tore off the page, and slid it across the desk. She told me that kind of analytical instinct couldn't be manufactured in a classroom, and she was not going to watch it spend the next decade filing reimbursement claims. Dr. Wyeth became the mentor my parents chose never to be. She guided me through the application process for a fully funded master's program in health systems administration. She drilled me on policy frameworks during lunch. She submitted a letter of recommendation that I was not permitted to read, but that, based on what came next, must have contained something extraordinary. I was accepted with a full merit fellowship. I completed the degree in 2 years while continuing to work. During that time, I monitored my family's situation through a prepaid device I kept in my desk drawer, not because I wanted contact but because I had learned the value of situational awareness. The messages I read painted a portrait of slow structural collapse. Vivienne had moved to a city apartment funded by my parents, pursuing a career as a lifestyle content creator. When that architecture failed, and it failed incrementally, then all at once, she retreated back to Connecticut. My parents had depleted their savings, borrowed against their home, and exhausted their credit managing her lifestyle. My father had a health scare that required hospitalization. The system they had built around protecting her was beginning to buckle from the inside. I completed my graduate thesis on equity gaps in healthcare financial access, published a portion of it in a policy journal, and was recruited by a prominent regional health consortium to lead their compliance and operational integrity division. I was 29 years old. I accepted, relocated to New Haven, and said nothing to anyone in my biological family about any of it. 7 months into that role, I received an email from the executive director of a National Healthcare Administration conference asking me to deliver the keynote address at their annual convening. The invitation described me as a rising architect of equitable systems reform. I read it twice in my quiet office and then called Dr. Wyeth, who had moved into a senior advisory role at a Boston medical institution. When I relayed the invitation, she was silent for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her voice, thick with something she almost never permitted herself to show. She said, "I found you reading billing codes during your break with worn-out shoes. And now you are going to stand at a national podium." I have never been prouder of another person in my life. 3 weeks before the conference, I walked through the events management corridor at the venue complex to finalize staging details. Near the service hallway, there was a collection bin for discarded items, forgotten umbrellas, cheap lanyards, abandoned office supplies. Something caught the light. I reached in and pulled out a slim silver pen. I turned it over. The engraved initials on the barrel read VC. Vivienne Calloway. My sister, who had recently accepted a logistical position with the venue's event staff after exhausting every other option, had carried my graduation gift to her new job and deposited it in a donation bin. I stood in that hallway for a full minute, turning the pen in my hand. It didn't hurt. The hurt had metabolized years ago into something harder and more useful. What the pen provided was clarity. A clean, physical reminder of exactly who these people were when there was nothing in it for them. Vivienne was assigned to work the conference. My parents offered complimentary attendee tickets through her staff allocation, had accepted, expecting to spend an afternoon in proximity to institutional prestige, entirely unaware of who was speaking. The morning of the conference, I stood in front of my mirror and put on my conference suit, the kind I could now afford to own rather than borrow. I clipped the silver pen to my leather portfolio. I walked to the auditorium with Dr. Wyeth beside me. I did not feel nervous. Nervousness belongs to outcomes you cannot predict. I already knew with clinical precision how this would proceed. From my position on the stage, I found them in the third row of the reserve staff section before the program even began. My mother in a designer suit she could no longer comfortably afford. My father, rigid with the performance of composure. Vivienne in her event staff polo, bored, looking at her phone. When the moderator introduced me and I walked to the podium, I watched it happen in sequence. Vivienne's phone hitting the floor, my mother's color leaving her face, my father's hands gripping the armrests. I delivered the speech I had spent 3 weeks writing. I spoke about the cost of conditional belonging. I spoke about the patients lost between systems because nobody thought they were worth the paperwork. I spoke about the advisors and mentors who look past someone's circumstances to see their capacity. I did not mention my family by name. I did not have to. Every sentence landed exactly where I intended. The standing ovation was not what I remember most clearly. What I remember is the weight of the pen in my hand as I stepped back from the microphone. In the lobby afterward, my mother reached for me with both arms, her hat slightly off-center. The practiced matriarch dissolved into something desperate and unmoored. I stepped back before her hands found me. I told her in the same measured tone I used to deliver operational findings to a boardroom that I had stayed away because she asked me to, and I had honored that request faithfully. My father arrived and tried to claim access to the morning as though proximity to my achievement was a family entitlement. I told him you do not harvest what you refuse to plant. My sister arrived last, still wearing her lanyard, and accused me of staging the entire morning to humiliate them. I held up the silver pen. I explained where I had found it. I watched the recognition cross her face. What followed was the most honest thing Vivienne had said in years, a raw, fractured admission that she had always known the difference between her performance and my substance, and that she had hated me for possessing what she had only been taught to simulate. My mother's response to her daughter's collapse was to grab her arm and tell her to stop making a scene. That single gesture contained the entire history of our family. I told them clearly, I had forgiven them, because carrying that particular weight was too expensive. But forgiveness is not the same as access. I was enforcing the boundary they had established. I was closing the door they had already closed. Then I turned and walked out into the afternoon. 6 months later, Dr. Wyeth and I formalized a grant program through my organization, specifically funding examination preparation and application costs for healthcare administration candidates from low-income backgrounds. We called it the Silver Pen Fund. The object that marked my lowest point became the instrument that opened something for dozens of people who came after me. The consequences for my family were the natural outcomes of choices compounding over time. The house was eventually foreclosed. The social architecture my mother had maintained for decades collapsed when the people who had witnessed the lobby scene carried the story back to their networks. Vivienne lost her event position for conduct violations and months later was working a customer service shift at a corporate coffee chain, serving the very drinks she used to photograph as evidence of her aspirational life. I did not celebrate this. Gravity simply collects what it is owed. What I understand now, with the particular clarity that comes from standing on the other side of it, is that the people who try to make you invisible are usually terrified of what they'll have to confront once you become undeniable. My family built a hierarchy because hierarchies protect the people at the top from examining the cost of their position. The table I built has room for people who show up, not for people who claim a seat because of biological proximity to someone else's labor. Have you ever had someone try to reintroduce themselves to a version of you that they spent years trying to bury and found that the person they were looking for simply no longer existed?